Listen, I'm looking forward to talking to my next guest here, and I don't think that there are two people better equipped to help us understand the political dynamic right now and the role of Donald Trump heading into the midterms. I'm talking about CNN Global Affairs analyst Susan Glasser and chief White House reporter for the New York Times, Peter Baker. They're the co-authors of the new book, The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021, which is the #1 best-selling book on Amazon tonight. Good evening. And congratulations. Why are you shaking your head, Susan? It's good.
Because, I mean, that, as my friend said, it means you beat out Goodnight Moon. I mean, you know,
I know.
come on. That
how
Amazon
dare
list
you guys.
is tough to crack.
Yeah, but this is some really important stuff here. And again, you break it down in the book in a way that's understandable and relatable to everyone. The book, Susan, has so much insight into the Trump years, the culture wars, that attacks on institutions, the relentless undermining of democratic norms. And yet you write, Trump still emerged from a 7 million vote defeat, 2 impeachments, and the January 6th insurrection as the dominant force in the Republican Party. So just right there, there's something for everyone. So explain to us, what does his grip on the Republican Party say about what is to come?
Well, you know, the image that sticks with me, Don, is a senior national security official who spent a lot of time with Donald Trump in the Oval Office, who said, you know, you want to know about Trump in the second term? Trump in the first term was like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. He learned to open the door. Remember the scene with the children hiding in the kitchen? Mm-hmm. And that moment when the velociraptor turns the handle? You know, the idea being that over time, Trump adapted. And, you know, he shed the staff who tried to constrain him. He ended up with Mark Meadows as his chief of staff. A second term, I think, would be a very, very different and altogether more disruptive thing even than the first term.
Peter, you know, we're seeing right now with the issues of immigrants, Trump built his political brand in part on, you know, building the wall. The caravans are coming, separating children from their parents. You quote Trump's former advisor, Stephen Miller, and his eagerness to go full Napoleon on that front. Talk to me about that, especially in light of the Republican governors transporting migrants to blue states, because this is just sort of, you know, the extension of everything that happened during the Trump, from build the wall to sending migrants to different states on buses and planes or what have you.
Absolutely. In fact, what people forget is that Trump actually threatened to do exactly this. He said, why don't we send these migrants to sanctuary cities and that'll show them? He didn't actually follow through. Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott have now actually followed through on what Trump simply threatened to do. And so you see, therefore, I think the effects, the residual legacy and effect of President Trump, even if he never serves another day in office. And then to Susan's point, if he does serve another day in office, you can be sure that he will follow through on some of the ideas that he voiced during his first term but felt frustrated or constrained, wasn't able to do, and would find a better, more compliant, more deferential set of staff to help him execute in his second term. So one thing that this book is important, we feel like, is not just as a matter of history, but also as a matter of prologue for what could be to come.
You spoke to Senator Lindsey Graham for the book. He's someone who became a presidential confidant, and he told you this, and I quote, "He is a lying mother effer," Graham said of Trump, with a what can you do shrug, but also a lot of fun to hang out with. Now he knows Trump is a liar, but is utterly willing, like so many other Republicans, to go along for the sake of keeping power, even after January 6th. None of that has changed.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, who can forget that memorable Lindsey Graham speech on the night of January 6th when he said, basically, count me out. I'm done. I'm over with this. He voted, you know, to certify the Biden's election and, you know, gave every appearance of moving on until literally days later, in which he was back on the Trump train. And I think that's a sort of a metaphor for the Republican Party as a whole. Lindsey Graham was very clear in 2016 on the nature of the threat. He himself said Donald Trump posed the Republican Party into the country. He called him a kook. He called him dangerous. He said he was the least suited man to the presidency. But he seemed to be dazzled by Donald Trump in a way that so many of these Republican officials did. You know, it's hard to delve into this psychology fully to understand it. But I think the book and the story of the Trump presidency is not just about Donald Trump. it is about those who surrounded him. Remember that without the Lindsey Grahams of the world, Donald Trump would just be an old dude shouting at the TV in between golf games.
Yeah. Listen, I'm still jet lagged from London, and so you writing that MFer, I actually almost said it in the lead up to you before the break, so I'm glad I did it. But listen, Peter, another key figure during the Trump years, former Chief of Staff John Kelly. I mean, he secretly bought a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, where 27 mental health professionals warned about Trump. I mean, Kelly thought that it would be a helpful guide. And I just want to know why he thought that, and also it's extraordinary the number of people who worked day and night to control Trump and contain the damage from him. They actually tried to control him. They thought that they could, but then realized they couldn't. He's not controllable.
What they try to do is figure out what made him tick, right? So John Kelly buys this book and tries to figure out, what are the mental issues here of the president that he's serving. He thought that this was a person who didn't know much about anything, didn't seem to process information, seemed off kilter in so many ways. John Kelly really came to loathe, I think, Donald Trump in a very visceral way. He brought this book to try to understand him, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, there were these debates. We've learned this since he left office. All this reporting we have in here is coming to us in the 18 months, basically, since Trump left office, when people are freer to talk about it, I think. But they debated among themselves. Cabinet officers debated among themselves. Is he crazy, or is he just crazy like a fox? And they themselves often couldn't come to a conclusion about that. That's why you saw a discussion of the 25th Amendment at various points in his presidency, because there was concern about whether he was genuinely able to execute the job of the presidency. Ultimately, since Mike Pence wouldn't go along, it was kind of a moot point. But it was a constant debate and a refrain through the 4 years.
Peter, I want to play this for you to respond. Trump was at this rally with J.D. Vance over the weekend, and I just want to play something that he said about how he views the country. Here it is.
Perhaps most importantly, we are a nation that is no longer respected or listened to around the world. We are a nation that in many ways has become a joke, and we are a nation that is hostile to liberty, freedom, and faith.
And with that music playing in the background, it's really kind of eerie. It's certainly a preview of what we can expect if he runs again, stoking anger and fears and tearing down institutions. What does it say that his message hasn't changed much, really, at all since 2016?
Right. In fact, if anything, it's going further, right? That music and the reaction of the crowd with the pointing fingers, the QAnon sort of symbology there at that rally suggests us how far into the world of fringe conspiracy theorists he's willing to go, right? He is entertaining and embracing a part of his own base that believes that the government is, a group of satanic pedophiles, and that Trump is the chosen one to save the country in a way that goes far beyond any other, mainstream Republican views. Mm-hmm. And I think that shows that he's embracing again that part of the country that is most normally, ignored on the fringe, but today feels ascendant because of his, in effect, endorsement.
Yeah. Listen, I got to say that just my favorite part of the book starts on page 12 and goes into page 13, and it says Trump tuned in not just to conservative media that slathered him with praise, but hate watch shows he knew would excoriate him. Even as he denied monitoring them, he regularly demonstrated granular knowledge of what Don Lemon was saying late at night on CNN, or what Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski were discussing in early mornings on MSNBC, yada, yada, yada. He referred to me as the dumbest man on television, as Psycho Joe and Crazy Mika. You want to talk to me about that?
That was your favorite part.
Don, you had a fan, you had a fan, you had a viewer, loyal viewers in this day and age. Will he watch you in the morning too?
Of course
I
he
suspect
will.
the answer is yes, I do.
He's obsessed.
One thing that stuck with me, Don, he's obsessed with television in general, and one White House official, this is an image that nobody's really picked up on, but I was really taken with it. This official, after observing Trump up close, told me that he was the first and only president in American history. Again, this is a White House official, the first and only president in American history who defined his job to be like Mike TV in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Remember the kid who is so obsessed with television, that's all he does all day long, and he asked Willy Wonka to transport him inside the TV? that was Donald Trump, according to one of his advisors.